Hey, I'm Bob Ward from Microsoft. Thank you again so much for literally spending a week away from your job. It's like that you have nothing else to do, right? Coming and learning about SQL Server. And what we said in the keynote, what Rohan said, what many of us said, we're so serious about making sure that you understand that this community means a lot. In fact, I don't know if you maybe have realized or not, maybe you saw it. There's a book you got when you registered, which is incredibly cool. And that is alone is a testament, because that is all sponsored by Microsoft. Microsoft is the one that actually said, Bob, we think that book's pretty cool you wrote. We're going to give every single person that signed a pass a book. That's amazing. And what other thing I want you to pay attention to very closely, and I really mean this seriously, in the book, in the dedication, and I didn't even hesitate when I wrote this, that the book is dedicated to you. The book is dedicated to #SQL family, because without you, we don't have a product. People from myself, from Rohan, down to Slava Oaks, to the people that write the code, totally get that. So thank you. Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you very much. Let's talk about SQL 19. And maybe you might have heard me speak about SQL 19. I've been doing this now for a while. But the number one reason I am so excited to be here at SQL 19 to talk about PaaS is I don't have to answer the question anymore, when is this going to ship? Because I have had that question since last September till now, and I've been dying to say, it's finally here. In fact, funny is a gentleman in the audience said, how come you don't call it RTM anymore? You call it GA, General Availability. And the reason is because RTM stands for Release for Manufacturing. In the days we used to press a DVD or a CD for SQL Server. So we don't call it that anymore. And people that are younger on the team still ask us, what do you mean when you say RTM? And we're like, forget it, you wouldn't understand. We used to press diskettes and DVDs. So hey, real quick, I want to make sure you understand a couple of things logistically. Good news and bad news. Good news is this deck is already on this site right here, AKMS Bob Ward MS. What you see right now is on the website. It's a OneDrive. You can just download the thing. At the end of this session, I have a slide I'll leave up that has other resources like our workshops, etc. Some of the demonstrations I'm showing you are in the book, actually. Some of them are not anywhere. It's the first time I've ever shown them before, and I don't even have them published anywhere yet, but I'll get them up there somewhere. The other thing is it's a big room. And unfortunately, and I love the people that passed, but I have to go to another session right after this in the other building. So it might be hard for me to stay after to answer a lot of questions. I'll try to stay for a little bit and answer some questions. And then after that, I have to go to another session called the Unplugged session. Here's my commitment to you, though. I will be in the clinic tomorrow afternoon. So I've got another session on Thursday, and after I'm done that session, I will try to come to the clinic. If I don't answer a question today that you have, because we're not going to be able to take questions in the middle of this. There's way too many people. I wouldn't be able to hear you in the back. When you're my age now, you don't hear anything. At least you make that excuse, actually. And so it's going to be hard to take questions in the middle. My email is bobward@microsoft.com. You get an email that's simple when you've been here 26 years, which I've been here 26 years now. So bobward@microsoft.com. I promise you, I will answer over the next couple of weeks every question you have about what I'm going to talk about. And you have the deck also available to you. Okay, let's get into this a little bit. So I put this slide up first, not last, in my deck. Why? Because I always forget about it. And I take it extremely seriously. So if you're thinking that Bob Ward never reads my evaluation, when this is done, I read every single comment, and I take it to heart. Not take it to heart that I'm offended if you didn't think it was good. It's okay if you don't think it was good. But if you say, I wish you would have done something different or else, I kind of take that as feedback, and the next time I present something, I take that as input. So please, take a second, and when you get a chance, fill out your evaluations. So this deck is actually based on a general deck I've built for Microsoft. So we present this talk at other places besides PaaS, and you're looking at the new polished version of this. I've been kind of presenting a beta version of this throughout the world, actually, for the last year. And so this is the new SQL 19 all-up deck, and there's mostly some of the same stuff we've been talking about, but a few nuggets of things that are specific to the general availability of SQL Server. And as I've done this journey, and it's funny because my boss asked me the other day, how many people do you think you've presented SQL 19 to since last September? And I started going, I don't really know, actually. I can't even remember. And I think it's something like 8 countries, 7,000 people or something like that. And I was blown away that I've exposed this many people to what we're doing in 19. And it's impressive that all of you are coming here today going, I still want to learn more about it. I want to make sure I fully understand what's in 19. Our goal today is to go over the major functionality and capabilities in SQL 19 that solve this right here. If you look at this screen, you may decide for yourself, I have one of those challenges. There's something that resonates with me on there. Maybe it's the fact that I would like to reduce ETL in my company. Maybe it's like the fact that I'd like to reduce the cost of performance tuning. That'd be kind of cool. How about for once I'd like to move to a release of SQL Server and I just get faster with no changes? That'd be kind of neat. I'd like to be able to do that. And then, of course, if you want to go off and do your own presentation, just put the word container or machine learning in the title of your talk, and you'll get a lot of people that'll show up. You may not understand what you're talking about, but just put that in the title and everybody shows up, right? So I've always told my team, just put the word container, machine learning, and you'll get a lot of people to come to your session. But seriously, maybe containers are something you're considering, or even machine learning is something in your company that's being discussed, and it's the hot topic, but you want to find out, does it even make sense? We think SQL 19 has solutions for all these challenges. And in fact, the overall discussion of SQL 19 is the following. Whether it's integrating, you heard this in the keynote this morning, whether it's integrating technologies like Spark and big data, whether it's having different platforms of choice available to you, getting not just fast performance, but intelligent performance, or maybe you want to make sure you provide a secure platform. You purchase a platform and a data platform that's very secure. Or you would like to use a data platform that's consistent from the edge to your data center or the cloud. We think SQL 19 is a platform that provides all of those things. Let's look at a little different viewpoint, but first, when I've been presenting SQL 19 to audiences across the world over the last year, I will start talking about something. I'll just say, hey, by the way, we're doing intelligent query processing, which is based on adaptive query processing. Or we're doing this based on query store. And they're like, what are you talking about? What's this query store thing? And so it dawned on me that because we have accelerated so quickly in our product, that some people forget, and it's not your fault, it's our fault, of what we've done in SQL 16 and 17. So make sure when you listen to what I'm talking about today, what is new in 19, you understand that you're getting everything we've done in 16 and 17. Think about this list right here, whether it be query store or automatic tuning or clusterless availability groups or row-level security. A lot of folks don't realize that I'm maybe on 2012 or 2008, and I want to go to 19. I want to know what I get. Well, I'm going to tell you what's new in 19, but you make sure you understand you get all of this as well. I call this my camera slide. I call this my camera slide because when I'm done clicking through this, people want to take a photo of it. And in fact, if you go back to your company, and this deck is up there for you, right? And somebody says, what is in SQL 19? Just show them the slide. In fact, it maybe starts with this concept. How would you like to be able to query data from all of these icons right here without moving any data? Or how would you like to build a solution or deploy a solution for Microsoft that includes a pre-deployed Hadoop cluster with Spark and get access to big data and integrate it with SQL in a way you've never even seen before? That is all a big part, and we're going to dive in a little bit what that talks about. Or in your organization, you're talking not just about running SQL on Windows anymore. We love running SQL on Windows, but there are so many other different platforms now that are considered to run a database. How would you like to be able to run a SQL database across all of this, and it's compatible? And what do I mean by that? Well, I've been presenting SQL Server Linux for a while, and the first question I get from somebody is, do I have to change? Do I have to change my tools, my app? And we're like, no. In fact, consider, how would you like to back up a database on one of those icons and restore it to one of those icons? And it just works the same. That's why we call it a platform of choice with compatibility. Now, you could in your organization be considering machine learning, and you've maybe heard about SQL machine learning. And we offer that, and we've been doing that since 16 and 17, but now we've taken that same platform, and we'll talk more about that platform because I want to make sure you have more of a secure feeling about the platform of extending the T-SQL language with programs like Java. So you look at the top of this is very modern stuff. And in fact, Travis Wright, my colleague, when we were building these things back throughout the release of 19, he actually said one time internally, he said, this really isn't your grandpa's SQL Server anymore. Now, I was kind of worried he was talking about me when he said that. But what he means is, look at all of this stuff at the top right here. This is kind of modern. It's new. If you're a core SQL person, it kind of feels like this is radical stuff, right? Now, my colleague, Pedro Lopes, says, but wait a minute. It is your grandpa's SQL Server. And what does he mean by that? What he means by that is that we still are enhancing and iterating the core engine that drives SQL. Why do we do that? Because that engine drives a lot of things that we do, not just in SQL Server, but in the cloud as well. And it's not about just being fast, it's about being intelligent. And we're going to talk about the idea of intelligent performance for SQL Server. And then we're going to talk about security, because it's one thing to be fast and to be intelligent and fast, but you have to be secure. So what are you doing in SQL 19 from a security point of view? And then finally, what about availability? You saw a little bit of a tease this morning in the keynote with this fun little demo Con and I did with accelerated database recovery. And we'll kind of unpack that. We'll go back and run that demo we did in the keynote, and I'll kind of unpack it a little bit more for you. So I see some folks taking a camera slide because it is the camera slide. You could go back and deliver the message I just told you to your organization and say, this is why we should think about this release. Look at all that's in there. When I myself bit this slide, I thought, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of stuff we've done in a very short time frame with putting power and capability into SQL Server. And if you look at that slide, think about how it solves the challenges that we talked about. Whether it's reduce ETL, whether it's gaining performance with no app changes, whether it's becoming more secure, whether it's running containers and feeling comfortable that it performs and it's the same SQL Server, or whether it's incorporating things like machine learning into my environment. So first, let's talk about intelligence over all your data. It feels like a marketing slide. It's not a marketing slide. It's actually the value proposition of something we're providing with SQL Server. And it first starts with data virtualization, and we'll unpack that in a second. But that really comes down to the fact of this removing ETL from your environment. I would like to use SQL as a hub to query data sources other than just SQL Server and not move the data. Because you know why? I'd like to keep my T-SQL skills relevant. I don't want to go learn 5 languages to get access to 5 data sources. I want to use T-SQL, use it as a secure hub, using SQL to get access to different data sources. That is data virtualization. And as we talked to customers about data virtualization, and we talked about the fact you can get access to Hadoop data, they said to us, hey, by the way, I don't really have one of those Hadoop things. Can you build one of those for me? Like, can you go provision one of those, and I can access that using this data virtualization concept? We're like, I think we might be able to do that. And then as soon as we said that, they said, well, my team who does Hadoop says you need Spark, because you're not credible if you don't do that. So what if we helped you build your own data lake by incorporating those technologies together? And then finally, we talked about machine learning. So data scientists and companies doing machine learning, and you saw some examples in the keynote, companies that are doing that, they said, we need an end-to-end solution now. We have too many disparate systems trying to build machine learning models. So we would like to access data like you're talking about over here, whether it be different data sources or big data cluster scenarios or Spark scenarios. We want to integrate all that data, but we want to build an application system so we can deploy a machine learning app. And we want to expose that app in a way that I don't have to understand R, Python, or even SQL. So a complete AI platform would be the next piece of the puzzle, and that's why we call it intelligence over all this data. Now it starts with data virtualization, and so we have this functionality called Polybase. Polybase started in SQL 16. In fact, actually started before that, and I talk about this in the book. I interviewed David DeWitt. David DeWitt and company in Jim Gray Labs, he started this concept called Polybase for a very, very practical reason. Most people deploying Hadoop systems are using a concept called Java MapReduce. And if you're a Java MapReduce programmer, that's wonderful. David DeWitt and team said, we don't really want to write that kind of code. We want to use SQL as a language. So they built an interface of SQL Server that would, behind the scenes, deploy Java MapReduce to access Hadoop data in a scalable way. And you come along with SQL 19, we said, you know what, that's interesting. We think, based on a company acquisition we made, we could incorporate different ODBC drivers to access other data sources the same way we did that with Hadoop. Things like Oracle, or Teradata, or SQL Server, or even MongoDB, which includes things like CosmosDB. And then along the way, maybe what we could do is allow you to bring your own driver to the game, you bring your own driver to the game, and access other data sources. Now, if you look at this diagram here, what if I could run a SQL query from a central SQL server and join across all of this? But not just do a join, be intelligent about it. Push down queries where it makes sense. Do joins intelligently. Do scale out distributed computing across all of this. That is Polybase in SQL Server 2019. That's the data virtualization play that we talked about. And in fact, consider this possible example right here. You and your customer and your company have SQL Server 19 now deployed. And you have these different data sources, but what you would like to do is not have to write SSIS packages all the time to move them into SQL. That would be kind of a nice idea because it kind of be expensive. SSIS is a wonderful system, and you still may need that, but consider this. What if you had data in a SQL server that you couldn't move into your new SQL server? It had to stay there. It's like legacy data that you don't use all the time, but you'd like to join it with your current data. Or maybe you're starting to deploy an application in the cloud with Azure, and it's a platform as a service database, so you'd like to join that data too with your local SQL. Or maybe it's a mobile app with CosmosDB, or maybe it's an accounting system with Oracle, where you don't want to move the data from Oracle. You're not even allowed to do that, actually. But you'd like to be able to join data in Oracle based on queries from SQL. Or maybe it's HDFS Hadoop data with reviews from a website. And finally, maybe there's a company you've acquired. Like the one example I have is Vandelay Industries. Oh, come on, is there no Seinfeld fans in this audience? We got to liven this up a little bit here. Come on, if you're a Seinfeld fan, right, you'll go look up. Okay, for those folks who are not very old, like you're young people, go search for Vandelay Industries on the internet and you'll see what we're talking about. So you've acquired a company from a merger, and they're running SAP HANA. And while during this acquisition phases, you're not allowed to move the data from SAP HANA into SQL Server, so you want to join data from this new data into SQL. I am telling you, it is possible to join data across all of this and not move the data from SQL Server 19. Now, that's interesting, but would be really nice, as we talked about earlier for intelligence over all your data, is to build a single solution. So bear with me for a second on this story. You're sitting looking at the data virtualization story, you're hearing about machine learning, you're hearing about Hadoop. It might be nice if in a single deployment solution, I could do the following. I could install SQL Server for you. I call that a master instance. Now, Polybase has a concept called a scale-out group. It's a distributed platform for you. So when you deploy Polybase, we can do scale-out distributed computing of your queries, which is one of the unique propositions of it over, say, a linked server scenario. So what I'd like you to do, Microsoft, is do this deployment and deploy the SQL Server. Then would you go ahead and deploy that Polybase scale-out group for me so I don't have to do it myself? We call that something called a compute pool. And so I'm going to use this SQL Server master instance to access through Polybase this compute pool. Now also what I'd like to do is I told you, could you deploy one of those Hadoop things for me? So we are going to deploy our own Hadoop cluster inside an environment called a storage pool. And we're going to make sure we install Spark compute engine with this, so if somebody wants to do Spark jobs, they can do that. We call it the storage pool. It is HDFS, and you're allowed to actually install or ingest HDFS data directly in here. If you want to access this, you're going to still use that Polybase external table concept to access this data. So if you look at this diagram right here, all I've done is I've deployed something for you where you still use your T-SQL skills to access data in an HDFS file system, and you didn't move the data into SQL. You just put data into HDFS in the natural way you want to do that. You could even use SQL to do it, but I'm still using SQL as a main access point. Now, I still want to get access to those external data sources that you told me about. Like, I want to be able to join my Hadoop data in here, these files I have, unstructured data, with those data sources you talked about. Now, Bob, what I really want you to do is I don't want to install the drivers for this. For Oracle, I don't want to mess with drivers. Can you go ahead and pre-deploy the driver for me so that when I go install and I go access Oracle data, I just go query SQL, I get Oracle credentials and Oracle data source, and I just go. And I want to be able to join this data across these kind of type paradigms. Now, that's interesting, but it could be that the data access you need is a little bit more performant, and it's more of a cache scenario. So you would like to take queries from the local SQL server or a join with the Hadoop data or the other data sources, and maybe on a daily or weekly basis, you'd like to cache those results into something we call the data mart. So we build something called a data pool. Now, behind the scenes, this is actually SQL servers that are deployed that you don't know. You don't access them directly. You still use this SQL master instance to access this data mart. Well, that's pretty cool, because what I'd like to do is I want to use this system to ad hoc query data anytime I want, but for reporting purposes, every week I'm going to deploy offline results from these data sources into this data mart. Now, we're smart people at SQL Server. We're going to make this highly performant. So we're going to shard your data, and we're going to put clustered column store on top of it. You don't even know that behind the scenes, but it's very, very performant. But again, my access point is still through the master instance. Oh, and by the way, on that Hadoop data, you said earlier for that Hadoop story, you use Java MapReduce. That's interesting, but is there another way? And I'm like, well, we're pretty smart people in SQL, so we think what we can do is deploy the SQL engine on those Hadoop clusters, and access the HDFS data directly for you. So it's an optimized way to access HDFS through a SQL Server. Now, I told you that I wanted intelligence, so I want a lot of language support. I've got a lot of data scientists, so I don't need just T-SQL. I need Spark, I need Scala, I need R, I need Python. I want to be able to run these different languages in this platform to access this data, but I also want to prepare and train what's called machine learning models. But I also said to you early on that I don't want people consuming the models to have to know R and Python. Like, what I'd rather do is deploy the model as an application in this thing and access through something called a REST endpoint. There's something out there called Swagger, and Swagger is a compliant protocol for accessing a model over a web page. Look what I've provided here now. I provided an end-to-end platform, a single deployment, to get access to all this data and deploy a machine learning model all in one stage. You could be accessing the data without deploying machine learning models, or it could be an end-to-end machine learning system for you. Now, customers that saw this were pretty excited. Along the way, they said, you know what, I happen to have an HDFS file system somewhere else. It could be an Amazon, it could be an Azure Data Lake, it could be a Pure Storage or Dell. I would like to mount that HDFS file system into your file system so when somebody accesses that storage pool, it's really going to my cluster. We call that HDFS tiering. Now, this seems like a pretty complex system that I'm showing you here, but I'm only accessing typically through a SQL server. You probably need some sort of control mechanism to all of this. This is all deployed on Kubernetes, and if you've ever looked at a Kubernetes solution, Kubernetes does something very clever called a Kube API server concept, and so we've deployed our own API server. So you really don't know much about this, except when you need to access a lot of this stuff, you're able to talk to this controller thing and say, how do I get access to the SQL server and all these different places in my cluster? And so we deployed this controller concept, but we got really smart. We know you know SQL. So we've actually built SQL in this environment to understand how to talk to that thing. So consider what I've drawn so far, that you can use T-SQL to do everything I've listed right here and nothing else. Or you could do other things like Spark directly or HDFS directly, some of those kind of type things as well. Now, what's missing from this diagram is high availability. Kubernetes provides natural high availability, which I'll show more in detail in my talk on Friday, but you would like an availability group. So could you deploy an availability group automatically for me? And then get this. If you add a database to that master thing, would you automatically add it to the availability group? Oh, and would you put the system databases in there as well? So if I make changes to those, can they automatically just be part of this? So without you configuring anything, from a pure AG point of view, you just declare it in like a file, we'll deploy that. And by the way, the final piece of the puzzle, I need Active Directory support. We do all of that in a single deployment pane for you. A single command, a single script, or a notebook wizard, we do all of this. And on top of that, we provide shared services for you to see metrics, logging, all sorts of monitoring information about this cluster. That is called a big data cluster. It's the integration of Polybase, SQL Server, HDFS, Spark, and machine learning in a single solution. When I've shown people this, and I piece it together like this, they're trying to still put their head around it. And then somebody asked me, how do I get access to this again? I say SQL Server. You use T-SQL as a primary interface to access data in this environment. But if you show this to somebody in your company that says, well, I'm kind of a Hadoop Spark person, can I do that as well? Like, yeah, we got you covered. You still can interface and do things in that environment. It's one of the most exciting projects and the most innovative things I've seen us ever do in my career at Microsoft. And then you're asking yourself, is anybody even trying this thing? We have several customers out of the gate that have done big data clusters and are running it in production, and one of them is a great story from Balzano. And one of the interesting paradigms I've noticed is customers that have wanted to see this during our previews are either customers looking again to just integrate big data, or customers where machine learning is a huge part of what they're trying to provide solutions for. Let's stop and take a look at this. Enough slideware, Bob. Show me the goods. So let's look at a couple of things. First of all, I want to show you, let's see if I've got this here. Yeah, I want to show you here. So first of all, this is a Polybase this is a T-SQL notebook. How many of you guys have an opportunity to see or try what's called a T-SQL notebook? And that's exactly what I expected. So let me stop for a second and tell you the power of what I'm showing in front of you. Forget I'm talking about Polybase, because this is really important to tell you this. You run T-SQL scripts today in your environment all the time. How do you normally document your scripts? With comments, right? And you know comments are actually part of the SQL queries we're sending to the server. How would you like to now document your SQL scripts with Markdown? Markdown documentation. And you could put images in here. Now what you can do is you could literally give somebody as a training guide a step-by-step process how to run something, and all my samples now have step 1, step 2, step 3. Here's the other power of this. Did you know I'm showing you a demonstration of how to use Polybase with Oracle without running anything? You're like, you're doing what? So the process to use Polybase is the following. I create a master key because I'm going to actually encrypt the Oracle credentials to access my Oracle server. Now you notice here it says completed successfully. That is the output of me running this. Now get ready for this one. When you run a T-SQL notebook, and what you do, how you run these is by you play these cells, we save the output in the file. Did you know that you can now demo SQL Server with a browser? You can demo SQL Server with one of these notebooks in Azure Data Studio, and you never have to run anything. Or consider a scenario where you're going to take a notebook, you're going to save the results and send it to a client and said, this is what it should look like in your environment. Or a client can run this and send it back to you and say, this is what it looked like when I ran it. No more saving results in CSV files or sharing things in screenshots. Just use notebooks now as your primary interface to run SQL scripts. It will blow your mind. And Vicky Harp will be very happy if you actually get on the internet and say, I like notebooks. There should be a hashtag. Hashtag I like notebooks, I think. So what I'm going to do for Oracle is I'm going to create a credential, an Oracle credential here. And then I'm going to go through and create a data source. This is me defining this built-in driver I told you called Oracle. And this is the location of the Oracle instance in my network. It could be on the internet. It could be in your private network. So a data source is metadata stored in SQL Server. I like to organize my objects in schemas. So I'm showing you a schema here for Oracle. And then here is the key. I'm going to create an external table. If you notice here, the table has column names. We must match the names of the columns in the remote table, but it doesn't have to be the same order, and you don't have to specify all of them. The types, there's type mapping. For a SQL Server data hub, for SQL Server Polybase external table, that might be easier for you to map those. In the documentation, we give you guidance. How would you map this to, say, an Oracle server in your environment? And then location is the key. Location is the instance of Oracle, the schema, and the name of the table. The location will be different depending on the data source you're using. Once I create this table, here is the key point. I'm not storing any data in SQL Server. I'm storing the metadata of this external table. So what happens when I create this? What happens to what do I do? First of all, you can create local statistics in your SQL Server. You can give our query processor an opportunity to understand what are the stats in the remote table. Then I could do a scan. Well, that's not all that exciting. Just scan Oracle data. But what are we doing here when you do this? You're querying a SQL Server table. We're taking that and recognizing that we need to go use our driver to send a query to Oracle to get the results. Well, Bob, what if I just want one row? Can you do that? Not only can we do that, we can support push-down predicates. So depending on the stats you provide, we could push the where clause to Oracle, let it process that, and just give us the result back. Or maybe it's a join. So having stats give us the ability to make smart decisions on join, and we're using the power of Polybase to all make this happen. If the Oracle system had partitions, we can even recognize that and scale out and read partitions in parallel. And then the real great value here is joining the data. I can join SQL Server local tables with Oracle tables, and to anybody running this query, you don't even know you're going against Oracle. That is the beauty and the power of what we're providing for external table Polybase in SQL 19. But Bob, you said somewhere that you might do a demo that you've never shown before. Let's go try that. Let's see if it works. So I have a SharePoint site, a SharePoint farm up on an Azure VM. It's called Bob's SharePoint site, or the BS site. Uh-oh, that's not a very good acronym, is it? I didn't create that on purpose, actually. So I needed to create a list in SharePoint. Maybe you guys have done this before, a list in SharePoint. And you can see this is a list of preparing for the keynote. We got to prep. We got to eat barbecue. We got to get our jerseys. We got to steal Rohan's jersey. And then Connor's got to make sure this all works. So that's my list in SharePoint. And then maybe if you have faced this problem before, wouldn't you like to be able to query SharePoint without directly querying SharePoint databases? So if all this thing works right here, I'm going to go over to this server with Polybase, and I'm going to try something. Oh, let's see, how's this going to work here? Let me go bring up my folders. Oh, yeah, I happen to have a SharePoint one. Look at that. Now, before I show you this, let me show you this website. So I told you could bring an ODBC driver of your choice. There is a company named CData. This isn't a promotion for CData. This is me just blowing away what they do. Look at all the icons that they provide drivers for. You could go in and install one of their drivers to access anything you just about want in the world. And in fact, when I was looking at their website, when I was thinking about this idea, I said, oh, they support SharePoint. So I wonder if I could install an ODBC driver for SharePoint on my SQL Server and then run Polybase queries against a table against my SharePoint list. That would be kind of cool. So let me go back over here and bring this up. And sure enough, I can do that. I'm going to do the same process of a key, a credential, a data source. Now look at this. Here is my driver for SharePoint, which includes my SharePoint list, my SharePoint site. Then I scroll down, I create a schema, I create a table that looks like a SharePoint list. The columns match the fields of a list. And I come down and I go, boom, there's my list. I was now able to use a SQL Server query to query a SharePoint list without directly connecting to the database that backs up the SharePoint list. That is mind-blowing. That is something that gives you the power now of using data virtualization in a new way. And if you don't think we don't support where clauses, I just went down and said, well, what about the ones that Bob has to do? And sure enough, I can even do a where clause as well. Way cool stuff. And think about any of the icons I showed in that screen. If I went back and look at this list, I can do things like, what did I saw on here that was pretty interesting? Yeah, LinkedIn. So what CData does is they expose a data model on top of any one of these data sources. It almost looks like Power BI, doesn't it? Except you're using the power of SQL Server from a data virtualization point of view to access any of this data. That is incredibly cool. So that, in a nutshell, is data virtualization. And big data clusters, the whole solution I talked about, my colleague James Roland Jones is doing a talk tomorrow where he dives into that architecture and shows you, it's a demo session where he demos every aspect of everything I showed you in that architecture. Okay, so that's intelligence over all your data. We talked about platform of choice with compatibility. And again, compatibility means take a database backup on one platform, restore it on another platform, use the same set of tools. Now, when we built SQL Server for Linux, one of the things we did is to make sure the engine, again, was fully compatible. But there were some features on the edge of the engine that didn't quite make that release. So you look at this list right here. You now can do replication on SQL on Linux, and it looks just like replication to you. Or change data capture, or distributed transactions, or machine learning, or Polybase, or even auto-configuring tempDB files. So Linux now, from a perspective of a feature set, pretty much looks like SQL Server on Windows. I have done demonstrations now where I've demonstrated replication using SQL Server Linux containers. I put Management Studio on top of it, and people don't know the difference. And I've shown replication snapshots. They're like, hey, that's pretty cool. How'd you do that? I'm like, oh, I did a container demo. And I've got workshops to show you how to do those kind of things. And speaking of containers, we've actually upped our game a little bit to ensure that we provide our container images in a secure container registry owned by Microsoft. Containers are images that are in a way like binary images, right? So if you're concerned about the security of those images and deploying those in your environment, we have a secure Microsoft registry where our products as a company, we put our images. We want to make sure we support popular Kubernetes environments like Red Hat OpenShift. So we support Red Hat images and even non-root containers to ensure we run supported officially in those environments. DV01 is an interesting company. A company that saw themselves growing not with both data, but users and an explosion of access to things they needed in their company. And so Postgres just wasn't cutting it anymore for them. And they came to us and said, we don't run SQL Server, but you don't have it on Linux. And we said, we actually do. And so they started working with us, and they now in production deploy SQL Server in containers at Linux for their solution to get scalability. So if you don't think it's possible, it is possible. What about the developer experience? We've enhanced SQL Graph. If you've never looked at that technology and you own a third party or have purchased a third party graph database, take a look at our technology. You may decide that I can use SQL Server now as my graph database without having to ETL data into a separate product. We now support UTF-8, and we've enhanced machine learning services with things like being able to run it in Windows clustering and supporting on Linux. One of the coolest things we've done, though, is extend the T-SQL language with Java. And if you're thinking today that I don't want to have to go purchase or use an Oracle Java, which you have to buy now, we ship an open source supported version of Java with SQL Server. It's called Zulu Java, and when you install SQL now, you get that choice. And if you're worried about it's running open source and I don't get support, we offer official support from Microsoft for that version of Java. The other thing you're wondering about is you look at this diagram going, there is no way I'm going to let anybody run an R, Python, or Java code on my SQL Server. No way is that going to happen. So think about this story with me for a second and see if you change your mind. Because I used to do this for a living. I used to travel around and talk to customers, and they did not want to allow those programs to run on their SQL Server. This box, you see that big box right there, is a SQL Server, for all intents and purposes, a computer, a server. The SQL icon is the SQL process itself. So first of all, to use this technology, whether you use machine learning services or use Java to extend the T-SQL language, you must install the feature. So you have to be an administrator to have rights to install the feature. Second of all, to use the feature, you must run spconfigure. So you have to have rights to do that as well. So first of all, out of the gate, nobody just gets to run their R code or Java code on your SQL Server. Third, in order to run this code, you must use a system stored procedure that everybody doesn't have access to. You have to grant them permissions to run that procedure. So there's a layer of defense mechanism going on here to make sure that you're going to control how this code runs. Now here's the great story. When you run one of these programs, SQL Server is smart enough to tell a separate process called the Launchpad process to launch a satellite. I know it's kind of a clever play on words, Launchpad, satellite. The Launchpad launches a satellite process, a separate process on the computer that runs those in isolation under a very low privileged account. So now you're not worried about somebody's Python code running inside the SQL process space. It runs on a separate account. And to top it off, Resource Governor is tied into this technology. So you're allowed to control CPU, memory, and affinitization to affinitize what processors this code runs on. When I've told companies before about that story, they all of a sudden, instead of just saying, no way I'm going to let you run Java, they're like, oh, maybe I'll take a look at this. Maybe this whole machine learning services thing is something I should really consider. Systems Imagination is a great company that is deploying SQL machine learning services in a production environment in their company. You also see that direct communications for performance between the SQL icon and the R code and Python code. That is a direct testament of how we're allowing these code to run performant and scalable on the SQL server so they don't have to do a loopback connection into SQL to get their data. So that's machine learning services, and we're using that same architecture to allow you to extend the T-SQL language through programs like Java using this exact same framework. Okay, remember that was the not your grandpa's SQL Server story, right? Data virtualization, Spark, Hadoop, and SQL. Running on Linux, running on containers, running on Kubernetes, running with Java, running with machine learning, stuff that's just like radical stuff for the SQL Server data platform. What about performance? We just announced, as Rohan said this morning, a new benchmark, a new world record benchmark for 30 terabytes on TPC-H. We also have demonstrations to show you that we can process SQL Server in 1 trillion rows in less than 2 seconds. So if you don't think SQL Server is fast, it's super fast. It can be as fast as you need it to be. But customers have told us, I don't just need speed. I need intelligence. I need to be able to move to a new version of SQL Server, and if possible, I don't want to change the code, but gain something from this. Like, what's the value to move to this? And so that is what we're offering now with something called intelligent performance, or overall, we call the intelligent database. In addition, we want you to have insights anywhere, anytime you need it with SQL Server. So let me stop and pause for a second and kind of give you a story about this. Okay? Let's say you walk up to a SQL Server. It sounds like a joke in a bar, right? You walk up to a SQL Server. You walk up to a SQL Server, and somebody says it's slow. And you're like, great, what does slow mean? And you're like, well, it's high CPU. Okay, that sounds pretty familiar, high CPU. So you look at it and say, well, SQL's consuming all the CPU. So it'd be kind of nice to know what's causing this. And so you find a given query that's causing this. And you're like, oh, this query, I know what it is. It's causing CPU. And I look at the user-associated query, and it's my vice president. And I'm running a report that query is running. And it's bringing us down. So now I have this decision to make. Do I kill the session of the query running the report, therefore causing the VP to lose what he's doing, or do I let it finish? How do you figure that out today without adding diagnostics to the server? You can't. You don't know where the query is in the middle of the query. Now by default, with lightweight query profiling, you're going to be able to tell that. You're going to be able to tell, I'm going to go in and look at the query plan in progress for a live query and say, oh, whoa, this thing is scanning like 1 billion rows and it's 20% done. That's a problem. I'm going to kill the session, ask for forgiveness from my VP, fix it, and then let him go forward. That's a much better story than if you just didn't know what to do and let it run all day, right? That's on by default in SQL Server 2019, lightweight query profiling. You combine that with the power of something like Query Store, and now you have a very rich performance scenario of gaining insights anytime, anywhere you need it. But what I would like to do also is just gain performance without changing the app. And so we have built into the query processor a lot of intelligence. Now, every time I show this slide or talk about this functionality to a customer, they're like, how do I get the intelligent query processor feature? What do I pick when I install SQL? And I'm like, you know what, we're doing the wrong way. We're pitching this the wrong way to you. It's just the query processor. You just install SQL and you get this. They're like, what? What do you mean? I get all of that right there? You're like, yeah, you get all of that right there. And if you saw what we did in the keynote this morning, what you do to light up this functionality in the processor is you go to the latest compat level of SQL Server, the latest DB compat level. So you're coming along, you migrate to SQL 19, you use the current compat level of your database, which may be for 2012 or something, and we're going to talk about the end about DB compat certification. You hopefully have gained about equivalent performance as you had back when you were using 2008 or 2012. Then you move to the latest compat level, and based on some of these scenarios, you get better performance. For example, memory grant feedback. And we're going to show you a demo in a second of like, what is a memory grant feedback and why do I even care about it? These scenarios right here don't represent a developer sitting in a corner saying, I think I'm going to build adaptive joins. That just sounds like a kind of a neat thing. Nope. These are all based on actual customer experiences, both from CSS escalations, from customer feedback from the field, or us doing our own testing based on customer workloads. Every one of these things is built into the query processor. My goal at some point at Microsoft is I never have to show this slide. The query processor is just something that you're just amazed by. It just gives you better performance all the time, adapting to any workload you throw at it. Now we realize there are other workload patterns that need to get more performant. Maybe here's this class 2 example. You want to go build a clustered index on an identity column. Sound familiar? An increasing key, but you don't do it because of this kind of nasty problem where we all line up at the end of the table with a latch problem. You're like, I've heard of that before, and I have to redesign my app to get around it, so I don't even do that anymore. Well, with some new functionality to give a property to an index now, we can optimize access and reduce latch contention on an index on an increasing key. We call that sequential key inset performance. In addition, we want to take advantage of new hardware technologies. You would like to be able to use things like Intel Optane or NVDIMM technologies and use them to avoid I/O performance problems. You'd like to accelerate performance because you're buying this new hardware technology. And in SQL Server, we've baked into the engine the ability to recognize those design patterns and increase I/O performance. In many cases, we are bypassing I/O code in the kernel stack to take advantage of the fact that these look like memory to us in SQL Server. We call some of that functionality hybrid buffer pool and persistent memory support. If you look across this paradigm of everything I showed you right here, we call this intelligent performance for this reason. We are allowing you to either A, make a small configuration change, or B, we just auto-detect something and you didn't change a single line of code and you just got faster. Well, what about that last line called tempDB, Bob? You didn't say anything about that thing. Well, tempDB. Does anybody care about tempDB in here? No, you never dealt with that before. You know, we really didn't design tempDB to be a thing that was causing pain for you. And when I was in support for a very long period of time, tempDB caused me a lot of problems, right? So what did we do? We came along and gave you a lot of advice on how to add files to tempDB. Now, did you realize by you adding multiple files to tempDB, you have helped our code? You have created a partitioning scheme for what we call allocation pages. So now, when we have to run a big tempDB workload, we can partition access to things called allocation pages, therefore reducing something you've seen called latch contention. Pretty cool. So you go through this process, and you've heard Bob Ward or Paul Randall or somebody tell you how many files to add, and you can debate that all day long. Should it be 1 per CPU or 8, and then start and add 4? We won't have that debate today. If you'd like to go back to 2011 on YouTube and watch a guy named Bob Ward for 3 hours talk about this and take a nap on a Sunday, you can go do that, right? Have fun. But let's say you get the number of files correct. And then you up your game. You up your 10 TB workload. And all of a sudden, these little latch things still come along. You're looking at your DMV output. You get something called a page latch up, and you're like, doggone it, I thought I got rid of that thing. And you look at the page resource, and it says something like this, 2:2:531. And you're like, what am I supposed to do now? So you go on the internet and you research, and a guy named Paul Randall says, go run DBCC page against this. I'm picking on Paul because he's a friend of mine. So DBCC page, you run that, and all of a sudden somebody says, you're out of support. Can't run that command, not supported, but you do it anyways. And you go in there and you find out that the name of the table is a very well-known table called SCHOBJS. Oh, that makes sense. I was using that in my 10 TB workload, that table right there. And you're like, no, I read up on the internet, this is called a system table. I don't remember picking that table in my query workload. And there's no such thing as a latch hint. What the heck am I supposed to do? Now, this is the phone call to Bob Ward support person in those days. Hey, Bob, I added all the files you told me to in that big talk you did at PASS for 3 hours that I listened to on a Sunday and took a nap on. I did all these files you talked about, and I'm still getting this latch weight problem, and it's on a table called I forgot the name of it. And I'm like, okay, no problem. Reduce your 10 TB workload. And I'm not making this up. The other end of the phone was silence. They're like, say what? Did you say I can't use more temp DB because of this? And I'm like, yeah, kind of. Like, I'm really like, in my voice, I'm kind of like, yeah, kind of. And they're like, okay, that's not good. So our team is not dumb. We're pretty smart. And what we love to do is we love to look at other technologies we've built and leverage that. Why not? Why would you just build new stuff if you've already built something pretty cool? We built a technology in 2014 called Hackathon. Anybody heard of that thing? In-memory OLTP. Pretty cool stuff. One of its properties is it's a latch-free technology, right? It's a latch-free technology. So the team said, we're having latch contention with this. Why don't we implement the system tables under the covers as a hackathon table? And to schema-only table, because we don't have to persist it, because 10 TB gets recreated every time you start anyways. If we did that and didn't tell anybody, would it get rid of this latch thing? And it turns out it does. So if you go alter server configuration for this option and restart SQL Server and go run this temp DB workload now, all of a sudden, you don't have any more latches. What? Is that even possible? That is us taking a challenge that you've known for years and saying, we have a solution for you. It's really, really incredibly powerful stuff to see. And that is the story of optimized temp DB metadata. But hey, let's go look at an example of intelligent query processing, which is that query processor. And I showed you an example this morning, right, with Connor, called scalar UDF inlining. But let me show you a story with something called memory grant feedback. This particular example happens to be in the book. It's kind of nice when you write a book because you get examples you can just show anybody anytime you want, right? You don't have to build a new example. But for you, you can go into the book, which is also on my GitHub site, Bob SQL, and you can just see the example yourself. So here's the deal. I've got this database right here, and I'm going to run this query, which is kind of like an aggregate type of query, kind of looks familiar to somebody, with using fact tables and things like a warehouse might see. And I'm going to run this particular query and kick it off. And it's going to take a while. It starts producing results here, but it doesn't finish for a while. And I'm pretty frustrated with this. And so it turns out what happens is when you run certain queries in SQL Server, you didn't decide this, but we did. We add operators called hashes and sorts. Anybody heard of hashes and sorts? They're like, yes, Bob. I've looked at a graphical plan before and seen those things. Now, it turns out in some cases, these hashes and sorts, not in some cases, but in every case when you do a hash and sort, did you know we have to allocate memory for the hash or the sort internally in SQL Server? And it's not the buffer pool. It's internal memory of SQL Server. What if we don't get that memory right? Because we allocate this up front, and we call that a memory grant. So cardinality estimation can affect these decisions. So let's say, for example, in this query right here, I think to do a hash, I need about like 100K of memory. I'll just throw out that number. And so we're running this query, and if you go back to this execution plan and look at it, and look at the details, you'll notice we have a hash match join, and we have a little warning symbol. Warning, danger, Will Robinson, right? And if I scroll here and look at it, it says I had something called a spill. Oh, that sounds ominous. What's a spill? Well, we ran this hash join. The estimation was low for the hash. We thought we only had to hash 100K of data. Turns out we had to hash several megabytes worth of data. So when we don't have enough memory for this thing, do you know what we do? We use TempDB as a paging system. We take your hash memory that we didn't have enough for, and we start paging things out to disk to TempDB. Whoops, that's not too good. And that is called a spill. So that's interesting, Bob. Thanks a lot. You just told us there's a spill. What are you going to do about it? Well, it turns out when you finish running this query, SQL Server can know the fact that we didn't allocate enough memory. We know. We just finished the query. We're like, we only had 100K. We really need like a meg. So what if you could take that query that we just ran, just scroll down here, right here. I'm going to take the exact same query and run it again and kick it off. And it's done. What? Well, go look at the plan. The plan's the same. The plan's the same. What did we do? The second time we ran it in cache, we changed the number. We said, we really needed a megabyte, so let's go ahead and make it a megabyte the next time. It's query healing on the fly. It's taking a grant scenario that caused you a pain and a big performance tuning exercise and fixing queries and adapting based on a feedback mechanism in the query processor so you don't have to deal with that anymore. That is incredibly powerful technology. Built into the engine, not a feature you turn on. You move to the latest DB compat level. It's the same query plan, but now it's faster because of memory grant feedback. And there's a pile of features and things that we do to make this happen. This morning, when you looked at scalar UDIF inlining, we didn't just say, oh, it's scalar UDIF inlining, let's just do a scalar UDIF inline. We did do that. But the query processor actually made other decisions to make that faster, including something called batch mode on row store and something called an adaptive join. It is our intention at Microsoft that we will build this query processor in a way that you're not even aware of this stuff in the future. We call this out now because we want you to know the value of why moving to a latest DB compat level could make your performance faster. So that's just another example of intelligent query processing. Okay. So now we're into the Pedro's, it is your grandpa's SQL Server, right? We talked about performance. What about security? So we released a feature called Always Encrypted in SQL 16. And there was a couple limitations to Always Encrypted. And one of them was the fact that we were limited on how we could do indexes and rich query computing depending on what encryption state you picked. So along comes a technology called enclaves. Enclave technology. Just double checking my time here. Okay, let's see. I started at 1:30. Did I really? I've been going that fast, huh? I got all that stuff to still cover. No, we don't have that much to cover left. Anyways, we talked about always encrypted start with in SQL 16. Along comes an enclave technology that allows us to do unencryption on the server now instead of on the client in a unique way, using both a virtualized and a chip technology, and that's part of SQL 19. We also have the ability to suspend and resume TDE scans, transparent and data encryption scans, to make that more performant for you or just schedule them, and to simplify certificate management. Through a single SQL configuration manager, you can manage certificates across all of your cluster nodes. But one of the more interesting scenarios we built that has been very popular when I presented it overseas has been data classification and auditing. So now with data classification and auditing, you can go through and take columns in your database and tag them with types and labels. The type and label system is yours to decide. You pick those names, whether it's GDPR or whatever it is. That's interesting. It's a T-SQL interface to make that happen, but the really power of this is audit. If you now audit your queries, you can audit access to that classified data. So for example, you could go through your database and mark columns specific to a compliance standard you need to have for your organization, whether it's a government standard or an industry standard. And then you could go through and say, I'd like to audit who touches columns as part of that standard. You have that now as a built-in T-SQL interface and built into the SQL Server engine in 2019. This is the one that it gets people kind of excited as you saw it today on stage. And as you saw, and I'm not going to go through the spiel again because you saw me try to kill Connor, his session on stage. Connor was rather funny because I was telling him about this and he goes, now what are you going to do to me? I'm like, I'm not going to kill you, I'm just going to kill your session. But does that sound familiar to you? Has anybody ever run into this problem before? Oh God, everybody's like, people back there, this lady was like, yeah, I actually have hit this problem before. I don't even want to admit I've hit this problem. Let's take a second and just kind of see what I did behind the scenes. let me just take a second and show you. I'll come back to this screen here for a second, because I didn't get a chance to unpack this. So here is that SQL Server that I showed you. And the behind-the-scenes keynote demo is this. I have a SQL Server without ADR going, and I basically come in and just do a begin, tran, and a delete of like 500,000 rows. And then I have a SQL Server where I turned on the feature, and I go through and do the same exact thing, okay? Now, what I do behind the scenes here is I've got 2 error logs up. Because you were seeing me flying around on the screen, and you're like, what the heck is he actually doing there, right? So I've run this, and if I've run this correctly, these are running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crash SQL. That's what I was saying this morning in the keynote. Let's go through and do that. And what am I doing to crash SQL? I'm just doing a checkpoint and a shutdown with no wait, okay? Now, when I do this, in the first scenario with that ADR, I have created an active open transaction of 500,000 rows that I've got to undo. I've got to undo that whole thing, right? Whether I killed it or not kill it. So let's go over here and start that thing up. And this is just starting SQL Server with net start on that thing. And by the way, I use a little clever technique in PowerShell called get content error log wait to do a tail of the error log. Let's do that. And you see it's going to come up here, and it hasn't even printed out the message yet. It's still trying to do the phases of recovery. Let me come back to the other SQL. I called it start SQL counterfix. Did you guys kind of find that was cute? Start SQL counterfix. That is just starting the SQL Server with ADR. If you go back over in this screen, can you see it starting that percentage? Has anybody ever run into this before? I mean, I have seen this in so many SQL. She's like, yes, I've had that happen before, and I hate it. And I get frustrated because somebody had a transaction that causes me to get in this state, or SQL got crashed in some scenario. So if I start the other SQL Server over here, notice when I run this tail of log, it's done. That is crazy. It's done so fast that I didn't even see the phases printed out. This person over here is still printing phases. This thing is done faster than a phase can be produced. That is one of the most amazing technologies in the core engine we've ever done. And that is part of what's called accelerated database recovery in SQL 19. It's available in Azure SQL Database, and as you saw also in the keynote, it powers hyperscale behind the scenes. Now, I've had some questions about this when I presented it before, like, this is too good to be true, it's not free, and so let's talk about it for a second. We have some time to do that. So this is kind of like what I've collected over time about how it works and some questions about it. So number one, you turn it on with the database option. It uses something called a persistent version store, This is similar to row versioning for you in TempDB, not exactly the same, but it is versioning, and it's in your database. That's why it's called persisted version store. And because it's persisted and survived restarts, this is why we don't have to worry about undue recovery anymore. We just use the versions to decide what was aborted. Because guess what? When you do a rollback now with this turned on, we just mark it aborted. We don't have to do something called compensation records, which is why rollback is so fast. When you run a rollback, you're going to hit the button like 3 times and go, did it roll back? And it's going to go, yeah, I've already rolled back. Why are you asking me? Because rollback is simply an abort operation. Now, here's the interesting part. It's independent of isolation and locking levels. So you still have all the capabilities of doing isolation and locking levels, but this is for recovery purposes. But here's the beautiful part. If you do want to use isolation levels, we use the versions in your database now, not in TempDB. So you can avoid storing versions in TempDB by using this technology. The other thing that we didn't mention today was log truncation. Look over here. This is the little sneaky part that we didn't get to cover because in the keynote you get like 4 minutes to talk about everything, right? So rollback happens very quickly, undo recovery faster than the phases can print out, but log truncation is no longer beholden to active transactions. This means that no longer can you, sorry, I got to pick on you in the front row, right? No longer can you start a transaction and go get a cup of coffee for 5 hours, and then you're managing the transaction log and the thing grows out of control. Doesn't happen anymore. Doesn't matter what he did. Doesn't matter what his active transaction is. The log can now be truncated safely because we have versions in the database. That is another great promise. And look at what we're solving as a challenge. We're avoiding rollback, bringing down your database. We're avoiding long transactions, bringing down a database. Recovery, bringing down a database. And log growing out of control, we've solved with a solution. But you have questions. Bob, does it require more space or is it cost performance? And the answer is yes to both. The question is how much? which is why we have a paper. Oh, I love my development team, man. Because I've been pitching this for a while now, and everybody asks me all these details, like, give me the numbers. And I'm like, go read the paper. So our development team that built constant time recovery built a white paper and presented it at a conference called the VLDB conference in August. This is a conference where people way smarter than me get to go to this event. And it's not about presentations, it's all about the technology. They got to present this paper there because it's very innovative technology. And in the paper, they talk about what can you expect from growth patterns here, from performance patterns here. And I'll just give you one short answer. If you were to use a very balanced, mixed, right workload like TPC-E type benchmarks, it is possible you can see as low as 3 to 5% hit on your performance using this technology. I'm not saying that's exactly what you're going to get. Nobody will ever say that. But the paper talks about those kind of measurements. If I told you you could get a 5% hit overall in your performance and get all of this, you might start raising your hand going, I'm going to take a look at this. Because 5% may be something you're never really going to see across all of your workload design, right? Will it still use versions in TempDB? If all your databases use ADR, no, they're gone. Because we use versions only in the system. And here's the one that everybody loves, is always on availability groups. When you do a sync replica, we're constantly redoing transactions in your replica, right? We're always doing redo and harden. But when a failover occurs, what do we have to do? We have to run undo recovery to bring you in sync. Well, if you're running this, a failover happens like this now. If redo's up to speed, the undo happens like that because the versions are in the replicas. Not only that, when you use a read replica, you didn't know this, when you're doing read replica, we're forcing snapshot isolation for your queries into TempDB. No longer. If this technology is being used, now your read replica queries don't use versions of TempDB, they use the versions in the database. Does this sound something that you're going to go back and maybe take a look at? If I had to think about features or capabilities or solutions that people have gotten super excited about, it's intelligent query processing, it's TempDB metadata, it's data virtualization and big data clusters, and it's this thing right here, which is why Connor and I picked that as the #1 demo we would show out of the gate this morning. And then again, we built this technology behind the scenes to power things like hyperscale in Azure. Believe it or not, we actually listen to you. You're sitting back going like, you don't listen to us. We do. We do. In fact, everything you've seen in SQL 19 in the camera slide, again, is not a developer sitting in the back room saying, I think I'll do accelerated database recovery. Kind of like a fun thing to do. We did it because of customer experiences, because of challenges and pain that you've run to that we think can solve problems. What I love about this team is that there are engineers and program managers that have big debates over things that seem small that are big. And one of them is this right here. This error message, the #1 voted feedback of all time, right? I've had customers see this slide and say, I'm upgrading just because of that, right? No, I'm really being serious. What I love about our team is that there are people passionate about things like this that get into a room with our leads and say, no more. I'm building this. I'm going to forego some feature to get that into the product. So these are all based on direct customer voted items, CSS cases, and you've known me for a while, right? I read the emails and see the debate going on. And they ask me too, Bob, what do you think? I'm like, yeah, you got to fix this thing, man. People are dying, right? Or other things we're doing in terms of helping you with configuration. How about memory grant percent and resource governor? If you want to use memory grant percent and resource governor up until now, your lowest number was 1%. What if you have a terabyte of memory? That's a lot. We now use we support a floating point for that now. That little thing got some customer in an event so excited, they just didn't believe me. I went back and showed them after the event, right? So that's about user experience. What about diagnostics? I told you before to get latch weights, you had to become Paul Randall. That's a scary thought, right? You had to run some undocumented DBCC page command. No longer. You know what's interesting about this one? It was the monitoring partners that came to us. The monitoring partners said, you know, this latch weight thing is a problem, by the way, and we want to show this within our reports and within our tools. Could you provide a documented interface to crack a page? I'm like, to crack a page? And they're like, yeah, can you give us DBCC page like supported? I'm like, oh, I think we can do that. So we provide system functions for you to pass in a page resource and for us to come back and give you the header of a page in the form of fields. Now you're like, well, that's really cool. Why does it matter? Because you get the object name. So now for a page latch scenario, you can run that query right there, and you can get the name of the objects for page latch weights in your environment. That seems small, but a lot of people think that's very significant. And then finally, in terms of performance, I love this story. So, as you know, in many cases, I've been speaking about performance now for a long time at Microsoft. In many cases, I go deep dive at all the stuff we do in performance. What I love about our performance team that we have within the organization is they're probably the most humble people we have in our engineering team. They all sit in the same area, and I've been there right in Building 40 sitting with them, and I'll walk in, and they're all just, working on their computers, working away. I'm like, hey guys, really loud. And they're like, it's Bob again, Here's Bob from Texas coming in. But then they're like, hey, Bob, what's going on? I'm like, hey, I'm fixing to go talk at PASS about performance. What did you guys put in the engine that I haven't heard about? Well, have you heard about the fact we're doing inline log writing now? I'm like, what? I didn't know you were doing that. Yeah, actually, we put that into the server because we found out it could be more faster and performant. And they're like, this one developer said, does anybody care about that? I'm like, yes. They want to know what you've put in the engine to make their workload faster. Because you can get faster by doing these things. We built this functionality not because you have to know about it, because to show you we care about making this a faster engine for you and perform it when you need it, because this was all based on customer experience. So those are performance enhancements. Again, you're not going to light this stuff up. You're just going to get to SQL 19, and you get all this stuff in the engine itself. Okay, you want to migrate and modernize. Your decision now is, I went to Bob Ward at PASS. He talked about some really cool things in SQL 19. I'm in. I want to go. I want to do SQL 19. I'm ready to do it. I get back to my office and go, how do I do that? I want SQL 2008. I want 2012. I don't know how to go move to SQL Server. Maybe I'm on that company that starts with an O, and I'd like to move to SQL Server. What do I do? Here's what you do. You go watch the Pam and Pedro show. That's what you do. It's not a new series on NBC. It's a video. And I've got the resource at the back of this deck, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called Modernizing the Right Way. And they're speaking about it at this conference. They're taking their video on the road and doing sessions here. I love the approach they have. They take migration from a strategy perspective. Hey, here's what you do pre-migration. Here's what you do during migration. Here's what you do during post-migration. They show you the tools. They give you the strategy. They give you the experiences. They give you everything you need to make smart decisions and as quickly as efficiently possible migrate, but do it the right way. And the right way is not an arrogant statement, it's the smart way. So why not use the experience from people like Pedro Lopes and Pamela Hood on how to move? Because you know what? They've been doing it for a while. So take a look at that video. It talks about all these tools, including Data Migration Assistant to look at pre-migration configuration data. How about Database Experimentation Assistant? How about comparing SQL workloads across versions and looking at the performance differences? Or how about what I call Pedro in the box? How about once you've migrated, taking your workload, using Query Store, and having Pedro give you, through Management Studio, a series of specific suggestions on how to tune your query. Like literally the experience of the engineering team built into a tool. Those are what we have in terms of migration tools available to you. And then again, the SQL Server Migration Assistant is still a really excellent tool from considering of migration from other third-party products into SQL Server itself. So that is the Pam and Pedro show, Modernizing the Right Way, and they've taken the show on the road, and they're here at PASS talking about it as well. In fact, you were here today because you're part of the second part of our Pathway series. Have you ever heard about the Pathways at PASS? It started with a session I did before this called What to Choose When with Anna Hoffman. You're here as the second part of the pathway for SQL 19. Did you realize you were a part of this pathway? Sorry, there's nothing on the floor that directs you to the pathway. But in the session guide, you'll see other pathway sessions. So Pam and Pedro are doing migration sessions, and then I'll end the pathway on Fridays with a deep dive in Kubernetes. If you were hoping to come see me at the conference for something really gnarly, that would be your chance to go see that. I don't think I use a debugger, but I'm happy to just put it on the screen to make anybody excited. So this is something I'm very passionate about, and Pedro's extremely passionate about, and I think it's something that could be a game changer for you. You have developers in your company, or more importantly, you probably work with ISVs that have applications that say, not ready for SQL 19, sorry, can't do it. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds familiar, right? What if I could tell you it would be possible that you could convince, or we could help you convince, your ISV or your developers to certify their app on a compat level, a DB compat level. And you're like, what do I get from that? Like, what are you talking about? What if you could move to SQL 19, keep your compat level of, say, 2012, right? You keep that database compat level. We would make sure you're not going to break. We would ensure your query plan shape stays the same, which means your operators kind of look the same. So for the most part, if you've got kind of similar hardware, this is going to be like the same performance you got before. But then I get things like ADR and data classification and all this other rich functionality that is not dependent, or data virtualization. It's not dependent on database compat level. What if I could do that? And then when I'm ready to make that move, I can use Query Store to compare the difference between my current compat level and my new compat level, and I can make the final leap. It's a staged process. What if your vendor started certifying on DB compat? That is what we'd like to do. That's what we'd like to push. It's not an official program yet. We'd like it to be. If you go to aka.ms, DB compat, Pedro has a documentation page that literally says compatibility certification. And it gives you every step-by-step approach of what we're talking about, whether it's protecting you from deprecated features, deprecated functionality, or even query plan shape scenarios. So that's something we're passionate about, and we think it's something that's really, really going to change the game for you. Let's end the conversation with additions and then talk about resources for you. Additions are one of the most passionate discussions that happens sometimes in the community at Microsoft, and I've seen it over 26 years. And if you don't think within the engineering team we don't get passionate either about this stuff, we do. Which is why we're proud to announce today for SQL 19 that transparent data encryption is now available in Standard Edition. That is direct feedback from you telling us that's a core security feature, it should be in Standard Edition. And so we've done that. Second of all, we've had people look at this Polybase thing going, well, that's pretty cool. Do I get that in Standard Edition? And prior to this, you didn't. Now you do. You get Polybase, at least a single head node in Standard Edition. And then, more importantly, you really love that ADR thing. That is really wicked cool. Do I get that in Standard Edition? You get that in Standard Edition. So I'm here today to tell you that your feedback to us on what goes in the editions do matter, and it directly impacted. And in fact, I saw the internal conversations. People were saying, do customers really want this? And we're like, yes, customers really want this. So your feedback all went into the decision of what we put in the editions of SQL Server. Crazy stuff, right? Crazy stuff. SQL 19, not your grandpa's SQL Server, but your grandpa's SQL Server. What did I just cover today? Big data clusters, data virtualization, icons of Linux and containers and Kubernetes with SQL Server running everywhere as the same core engine that is compatible. Crazy stuff like running machine learning models with SQL Server or Java extensibility in a secure, isolated, governed fashion. Intelligent performance, not just being fast, being faster with no app changes. Enhances security, things like classification and enclaves. And then finally, this just incredibly cool technology called accelerated database recovery that could be a game changer for your business in terms of uptime. All of that in SQL 19. Consider these resources. Number one, AKMS SQL workshops. How would you like to go back to your company and go try everything I just talked about today for free? From training from the engineering team, not built by a training company, built by us. We wrote the workshops, the scripts are all there, it's all on GitHub. And by the way, you see this thing called SQL 19 Learning? How'd you like that GitHub site to have embedded video learning in there? So you go to a GitHub page, you read the training, and then you watch a video. Well, maybe you want to learn by example. You saw that T-SQL notebook thing I showed you? We've built a series of notebooks for almost every feature in SQL 19 for you to go through, and they're saved. So you can literally go by learn without even running SQL, go through and look and see how the features actually operate. Here's the modernization video, and then of course, you must end with a shameless plug. This was a labor of love. I cannot believe I wrote a second one of these things. And here's what I love the story about it. I tell stories in this book. I interviewed Slava Oaks. I interviewed Travis Wright. I interviewed just about everybody in the team, like, where did this come from? How did you come up with this idea? So one of the cool things about the book is learning about the history of SQL 19, but also getting some insights, things that you may not just realize that you're getting from the product, chock full of examples, chock from my conversational style and my perspective of a journey I've had starting since last summer working in this product. Thanks so much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the rest of this conference, and I hope all of you get to try SQL 19 soon. Thank you.